What's up, everybody? Quiet Mills here, trying not to piss the wife off. Coming at you with a brand new Valorant video, and in this video we're going to be breaking down how to absolutely dominate ranked with tips on rushes, how to stop rushes, when to lurk, how to counter lurks, and so much more. So make sure you smash that like and subscribe and watch it to the end if you want to pop off in your ranked matches. But go to the GameLeap website in the links down below for high quality, in-depth advanced guides, VOD reviews, tips, and tricks. We got so much damn content on the GameLeap website that you got to go check out right now down below. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. So first we're going to talk about you playing attack, and we're going to talk about the two predominant styles of play, rushes versus slow pushing. Now, before we talk about slow or default pushing, let's talk about rushes when they're applicable, when they're really freaking good, and when you might be doing them too much and it's costing you game. There are a multitude of benefits that can happen when you just rush and rank. The biggest one is just the nature of ranked. It doesn't take a lot of communication to slow peek and not die, but it's pretty easy to just say, let's push freaking W key on the point. But there's a lot of things that can just shut you down, right? You're not baiting out any utility. You're not checking to see how many enemies are there. Enemies are gonna get a read on this, that they're gonna rotate a lot more quickly. Versus have a lot of ways to punish it because it's a lot more predictable. And while yes, at the lower ranks and just in ranked queue as a whole, you can just psycho rush on the point, it is typically something that you want to be doing as a mix-up when your enemies in your game start figuring out how to counter it or your rushes go wrong. Even if just one rush goes wrong, you need to revisit the drawing board, and typically you want to take things slow for a while before you go back and try some other types of rushes. And that being said, something that's really important about rushing in general is rushing is a great way to catch enemies off guard and get that numbers advantage or be able to refrag and trade for better guns. That's why when you have much worse weapons than your enemies, you are better off rushing typically. However, there are some guns that play far better with rushes and some guns that play far better with lurks. For instance, if you and your team are rocking SMGs like a Stinger, for instance, then rushes make a lot more sense. But if you're rocking a lot of weapons like Sheriffs, then lurking and playing slow makes more sense, trying to find key pickoffs. So it's important to understand what you're trying to do before the round starts, rather than have a mismatch of guns on your team that don't necessarily match with the style that you're trying to incorporate in that round. Now, the next thing that we gotta talk about is slow pushes on attack, pushes that bait out utility. You're trying to bait out utility, you're trying to make sure that they use all of the big stalling utility at the very minimum. All the things like slows, paint shells, things that can completely stop your push or shut it down. That's the utility that you have to bait out, absolutely. And then, of course, you can take your time and play slow and try to bait out even more, but there are a few types of utilities that you absolutely have to bait out. But there's a certain game of chicken you're playing with an enemy, right? Let's say you're pushing a site and it has one choke point, you and your team, and there's a brimstone, right? If you just walk up to that choke, maybe that brimstone will just pop a molly and you're like, hey, we can just rotate off. He popped this molly, he wasted that utility. Well, eventually that brimstone's gonna learn a little bit. He's not gonna freaking pop his molly right away, but you need to start positioning more and more aggressively to the point where if he tries to molly, you can rush in and completely ignore the ability. And he knows this, so there's more pressure on him to utilize his ability or he might miss his window. And this is true for tons of different abilities. So it's just really important that you understand that dynamic. And if enemies wait too long or sandbag their abilities too long and don't utilize them because you constantly are just putting a little bit of pressure and rotating off, you can punish that by transitioning from that slow push to a rush out of nowhere when enemies are not investing when they absolutely need to, because after you get past that choke, that molly is no longer effective, those slows aren't very effective anymore, and it's a lot easier for you to get value even in the face of a lot of utility. Now, the next thing that we gotta talk about is dealing with rushes and slow pushes on defense. Well, the first thing that you need to do is figure out exactly how the enemy tends to play. When are they rushing? Are they rushing a lot? Are they playing slow? A lot of times teams, especially in ranked, will default to a certain type of strategy and they won't mix up all that much, especially if they keep rushing and it keeps working, right? Well, there's a lot of things that you can do to stop a rush or make a rush have very little value. You can play back a site, looking to play off your utility to try to get multiple kills as the enemy engage, especially catching off that person that is at the forefront, that duelist, that jet, that is way ahead of her team, and punish her and get that kill without the enemy team being able to refrag. Or if the enemies are just ability dumping, because this happens all the time in ranked, where they all group up, they just dump every single ability, flash, flash, dash, whatever the hell they want to do. They just throw all their utility and they just rush a site, right? And you're realizing that this is happening to you. You're like playing on point somewhere, and all of a sudden there's just a million amounts of utility just being poured on top of you, and it doesn't feel like you could do anything. Well, there's two big solutions to this. You could either, one, try to make an aggressive play, cut them off while they're setting up for this type of ability rush. You could do something like a dash with an Omen Paranoia, or there's a lot of different combos that you could set up with other teammates. We've talked about those in other videos. Or you can just freaking leave the site. If the enemy want to take site control, it is not worth you holding on that site control if they're just going to overuse all the utility. Because yeah, you're in a retake scenario, which sucks. But guess what? You have that they don't have. You have loads and loads of abilities that you can use. You can group up, use to take a point, and they do not have any abilities to stop you. So in that regard, you're going to be able to retake point control. You're going to be able to put pressure on that spike defuse, and you're going to put the enemy team in a really bad situation. Now, of course, the other style that can be pretty annoying, especially in ranked play, is when the enemy team never commits. Like, they just keep playing slow. They're looking for opportunities. Eventually, they get a pick, and then they finally decide to commit. The way to beat people that are extremely slow, just trying to bait out utility, trying to find information, is you, one, don't want to aggressively take aim duels up against enemies that have better effective ranges than you. So if you have something like an operator, you can look for picks all day against a slow strategy. But if you're rocking an SMG or even a Phantom up against a Vandal, you typically want to, yes, peek temporarily for information, but you don't want to be full-on challenging enemies. Force them to commit utility to try to take site control. Don't just let them get free picks just based on looking at the site. On top of that, you need to start getting a read on how they rush and when they rush, because just like we talked about before, it might be a good idea for you to sandbag a certain amount of your abilities. Just because enemies are playing a default, poking a little bit doesn't mean you need to just dump your utility to try to stop them, because if they're not very likely to rush, or they don't rush historically throughout the course of the game, then you don't necessarily want to just dump all your utility and then not have it. And if you do dump all your utility, realize that you're vulnerable and you might need to reposition accordingly, even if that means backing up, giving a lot of side up, or playing more of a high risk, high reward angle to try to turn the tables when you get pushed upon, because playing off your utility is no longer going to be an option. Now, the most powerful strategy, in my personal opinion, for average ranked play is lurking. So I'm going to tell you when you should be lurking and how to also counter lurking, two very important things. So first up, let's talk about lurking in general. Who can lurk? That's the first thing that we need to talk about. What are the characters that should lurk in general? Well, pretty much any character can lurk. There are going to be some characters that are much better at it, but it really depends on what your primary job is on your team. For instance, if your team is trying to play default, right? They're trying to bait out utility, and eventually they're trying to push a site, and you're Sova, when you eventually engage upon a site, you have your recon to gather information, and you have your Sova drone, right? So if you're off lurking through mid and your team is trying to push A, you're gonna make it so you cannot help your team engage, which is like your predominant job. So in that regard, it doesn't make any sense for a Sova to be lurking. Now, there are some characters like an Omen, for instance, that can still accomplish his job while lurking a different angle. You just gotta make sure that you're not too aggressive with your lurk until you've fulfilled your primary objective, which is smoking off those really important sight lines. Other characters like duelists can, of course, utilize a lurk to get tons of value, but you gotta make sure that your team has adequate ways to get onto point, because if your team has no flashes and no other duelists besides you, or their other duelists might be like a Raze and they're not very proactive, and your Phoenix lurking through mid, your team are going to have a really hard time pushing that point. And while maybe you could get some value on a lurk, it's going to be far better if maybe you put someone else on the lurk and you are the one putting all the pressure on the point, so enemies cannot check all these angles, and they would be far less likely to catch a lurker off guard. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about in this video is how to counter lurking. Now, lurking is really powerful, especially for ranked, because there is not a lot of transfer of communication. People are not careful with the information that they're giving up, and they are not diligent with regaining space when they leave it, right? So, for instance, you left garage for like 30 seconds, and you're like, hey, well, you know what? I'm just going to run right back. I went to mid for a little bit, but I'm going to run right back to garage, and there's like a lurker there, and you die. You die for free. Now the enemy are going to push in, rush into point, and now your team is in a 4v5 retake scenario when the enemy has spike down. This is because you didn't, one, realize that because you were gone from that location for a certain period of time, there was an information gap that you really need to keep in mind. If there's an information gap for too long, enemies could have hypothetically lurked up in that space, and you have to be diligent about retaking that space. Whether or not that means go with multiple people, use utility, or be very safe and diligent, whatever you have to do, you got to make sure that you don't just re-go back to space, that there's a possibility an enemy could have lurked up, knife out really quickly, and taken that space right from you. Now, it's one thing for you to also do this, but you also gotta really communicate this to your allies. If you were gone from mid for a small amount of time, and then eventually you pushed A, you need to communicate to your teammates that might be rotating back to take your spot or rotating through mid or wherever they're going, that you left that spot for a certain amount of time and that enemies could have already lurked up. You don't communicate that to your allies, that lurker, that enemy lurker that lurked all the way up is going to be able to get multiple kills on your allies for free because of your lack of information, when your allies are just assuming that you would communicate that, or you know for a fact that no enemies lurked up, which you really don't. So just keep all this in mind. Make sure that you're really communicating. Make sure you understand about the information or the lack of information on your team. And also realize that in ranked, your teammates are not always going to communicate what they should. So it's a good idea to always keep in mind what information is lost. Look at that minimap from time to time. Notice when your allies are leaving a point or going back to a point. And while this can be difficult to develop, it's part of your game sense to start to predict and analyze possible plays by the enemy so you never get caught off guard by anything, including lurks. But go to the GameLeap website in the links down below for tons more in-depth analysis just like this on the GameLeap website that you got to go check out. And we have in-depth guides over every single agent, so you got to go check it out right now down below. But thank you so much for coming to the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions down below. I love your faces, and I'll see you tomorrow.